It's my great honor to welcome Vulindlela Nyoni. Vuli is, we met very randomly. I was browsing on the department's website. So he's at Stellenbosch University's is it Visual Arts Department? Yeah. And and I was browsing online because I needed a project for the cover of a journal that I am the editor of, and came on to Vuli's printmaking website and thought this could be a wonderful idea for a cover, and we worked together for a month or so, and he came up with a fantastic design which now hangs in our office, and we had a discussion when I collected the print about Stellenbosch and about the space in Stellenbosch, and again, as I said, things that I know very little about as an economist, and I thought it would be wonderful to actually share some of these more personal thoughts about just space in the city of the future with you. Your CV, should I say, Marsh, you studied at the University of KZN, was there for a number of years. Were you department head there?
Department head for a while.
Yeah, and then somehow Stellenbosch convinced him to move down from the heat of Durban, and now he's here, and we are very happy to have him. Really, that's all from me. Down to you.
Thank you for having me today. Yeah, I feel a bit jealous about all your traveling and all that stuff I want to do there. I would like to, I'll give you some background to myself as I speak, because I'd like to speak mostly from a personal point of view. As Johan has said, I'm in the Visual Arts Department and I train people how to make things with their hands. But more and more I've found that the work that I do is actually more informative of my entire process of being and, as you say, space, place, and history and so forth. So I kind of wanted to title this kind of seminar, this talk, as Thoughts on Distance, Home and Belonging. And I'll give you some insight as to what that might be. But I've structured my thinking today on 3 lines of thought, or 3 lines of dialogue, and I want to try and keep these as clear as concise as possible. The majority of it will be kind of a recounting of what seems to be autobiographical, but actually it's been a long track of thinking to things like space, place, home, diaspora, and so forth. And I'd like to begin with a quotation by Wallace Stegner. And he says that home is a notion that only nations of the homeless fully appreciate and only the uprooted comprehend. So you guys are going to be sort of think tanking this idea of where Stellenbosch could become as a space, as a city of the future, and so forth. And I have been somewhat living a history in my own makeup as a somewhat of a nomad. So these thoughts are quite interesting to sort of play with one another. So to give you some background about myself, and what I will be doing behind me for the slides is really the product of a lot of my thinking. I'm a visual artist. I do exhibit in galleries. I try to sell my work. Doesn't work all the time. But I find that some of the things that I do or need to express in my own thinking only fuel my creativity a lot more. So you will be seeing my own exploits, and I also want to be referring quite heavily to a paper that I wrote for a conference called Impact 8, a printmaking conference, and there I sort of I referred mostly to the idea of settling in. I left Zimbabwe in '95. I was about 18 years old, 17 years old, and I got onto this bus and I traveled across to a country I'd never been into before, and it was 5 in the morning that I left this bus, got out of it, and I was on the doorstep of Pietermaritzburg University, 5 in the morning, not knowing anybody, and I stayed there for 18 years, becoming what I am today, and 18 years after that I moved here. So I left home at 18, left Marisburg at 18, and I'm looking forward to the next so long. Maybe I'll move somewhere else. But this image here kind of in me encapsulates quite a few things that framed for me that historical journey. I'd like to just read a little bit here from that paper I referred to. I'll say I traveled to South Africa in '95, also in search of an education, and I made my home in Pietermaritzburg, KZN, for the next 17, 18 years where I studied and taught. I was struck by the fact that however one chooses to interrogate or deny it, home still finds currency in my creative endeavors in the most subversive of ways, whether it be through my own active implementation of a particular visual lexicon or allegories that link me to specific histories and traditions, or through the reading of my work by others. Other artists that have relocated either by choice have been raised in countries other than their places of cultural origin, and I use this word origin very carefully, also find themselves in the predicament of having to relate their work to a culture of growing internationalism in light of defining self as well. This kind of leads me to what really is at the nub of what I'm talking about, and I will be talking about later, is that through a process of distinct rupture from this place or sense of origin, one has to undergo a complete transformation or an adaptation in some ways to become what you are, operating adaptively in a space that you then grow to call home in some ways. I'm not sure how many of you know about the Stellenbosch situation in terms of the influx, perhaps, of foreigners, so to speak. Stellenbosch has always been an interesting space for me. I think, well, in the last 4 years, this is my 4th year here now. And I find it to be quite a challenging space. Every day is a challenge. So when it comes to identifying this movement or seeing traits of this movement, which are happening around in South Africa all the time, one needs to be aware that there are people moving in and out every day. It is a space of transitory, it's an interstitial space. It's a space that is about movement. Every day, hundreds and, I don't know, thousands of people come from Cape Town on their cars all the way to come and teach here. And it's something I said to you, I think, Johan, when we first met, that there is a great deal of intellectual capacity moving in and out of Stellenbosch University to enculture people. And I would really love to know what the university's carbon footprint is at the end of it all, based on how many people who move into the space don't stay here, but occupy, facilitate, manipulate, and also engineer the space and then move out again at the end of every day. So those are the thoughts that I had. Not only that, in terms of my own place point of origin, I suppose, Zimbabweans, the last census in 2013 that tried to establish an estimated number of Zimbabweans in South Africa, which is growing daily, was around 3 million. I might be, it's an estimate and they still haven't ratified those numbers. So that in itself is something to take into regard when you reflect on the entire population of the country. So in a piece like this one, which is called Makwerekwere, there are these, does everyone know what that word means? Makwerekwere.
It's very such not funny. It's like a foreigner, someone who's not South African.
Yeah, it's a derogatory term which refers to the sort of the language, it's xenophobic sort of language that, or perception of language that people might have from anyone who comes from the north of the Limpopo. In the same way that the Greeks calls people from anyone else barbarians or barbaros, meaning that their language is like a barbara and all the rest of it. Barbarian is a direct reference to that, and Makwerekwere is in some ways a similar context linking to that. So the piece called Makwerekwere here references the idea of the movement across the border. And I don't know if you can see it so clearly here, but there is an economic sort of reference here. I think I showed it to you the first time I came around with the Zim notes, which don't exist anymore. Sort of transmuting into these 10 rand and so forth rands. The figure, I've worked quite a lot with the figure as a space of reckoning because I'd like to can't get into it so deeply right now, but the idea of the human figure and the connectivity of my own body to where it is that I'm moving to is very, very important. So you'll mostly see a lot of figures in these works, most of them being my own body or understandings of my own body. The cockroach at the top there, of course, is a direct reference to Robert Mugabe in terms of his symbol of patriarchy, power, and political power. So the Jongwe, which is Robert's thing. So I've also been working around this issue of disembodiment, and the idea of disembodiment in a physical sense. Obviously, one sort of starts to respond to or think to the idea of amputation and dislocation and so forth. But I started to realize that the whole bodiness of self, as reflected in the text of Baba, Stuart Hall, and Edward Said. I don't know if you're familiar with these authors. No, some of you guys are not. I couldn't hear anything, sorry. I have someone from my department here. Yay, thank you. Edward Said, Homi Baba, and Stuart Hall are great proponents of post-colonial theory. And what they write about really is the idea of how one reestablishes processes of self, political self, space, and so forth, using these tropes of dismantling a post-colonial, or embodying a post-colonial discourse, shall I say. So the notion of disembodiment becomes a figurative representation of where one might feel like a piece of Lego left outside of the whole pack when you sell it to somebody. So that sense of disembodiment and that search for home is a constant process of negotiation in some ways. Either you fit in a certain space or you don't fit in a certain space. And so I've been working around the issue of disembodiment, and there are clear instances in the work showing separation from something, which is implied by the brokenness of limbs. I'm trying to say that we believe we are complete, but we're actually in a strange state of flux in our lives, moving and changing and shifting. That's for me quite interesting to reflect on a place like Stellenbosch in terms of where the flux might be maintained, where the flux is encouraged, and where one might think to themselves, is something being made to be held static in a certain way? Where is the flux being encouraged? Like I said, the growing sense of internationalism encourages an interstitiality within spaces, but more so, if we want to look at a city of the future, perhaps global cities of the future, one might start to think to yourself, actually those places are the foundation of that is flux. And if a city of the future was to exist, would it not be about fluxes and constant shifting and moving? So in this image, yeah, a lot of people are quite shocked by how easily I do things like this. You'll see a hand later on. I tend to chop my head off quite a lot. There's a second one. And this piece is called dislocation. So it's a head about that size, life size, and it sits on a piece of paper, not much smaller than the full frame here. So it just simply sits in this white frame, completely contextualized from where its point of origin might be. And for me, that's really quite exciting, the idea that one can move between, it's a very sort of post-structuralist way of thinking, the one that one has to negotiate and choose where one might be. I don't know if any of you featured at a talk that was given by Anne Phillips 2 weeks ago, which was called The Politics of Being Human. You went to it, okay. Very interesting talk. The book comes out in May. I think some people might be interested in looking at it. Okay, so let's get quickly to the next one. Okay, we can talk about that. So again, referencing places and where things that influence my my makeup and my history. One doesn't seek to become a political artist. All of a sudden you become one when you start making commentary. And the piece that was here called Murabatrina, which is another Shona word for, that's a Shona word for the political process that Robert Mugabe put in place, which was to get rid of his informal tradesmen in the city, to beautify the city to some degree, actually to give more space for his own businesses to make more money within the city. It was an economic drive, and people were forcibly removed from the inner city to make sure that the centralized pool of economy was controlled in that sense. And so you had people being chased down by police forcibly. So at the top, something I think you might all recognize, the Ghana Go bag or the China bag, as some people might reference them to be. You can fit a whole person into them. These were became synonymous with this idea of migrants, the idea of movement, and the idea of packing everything that you had into one bag and crossing the border. Below that is another self image, and what I did there was I adopted a particular persona as an avatar, who's this king of fools, who you'll see later on. Played with this word, the word play became interesting. Fools and fools in Afrikaans is for means birds, right? Yes. It could mean something else. But fools is birds, and my name directly translated from Nyoni is bird. So there are all these self-identifying practices that I was trying to work with as well. So in that, there is this king of fools who's sweeping up his own territory, marked by the money again. Again, with this whole idea of getting rid of what you don't want within your space, that is not a negotiable thing. You have xenophobic attacks happening in Soweto, for instance. You have people throwing people out of McDonald's saying they don't speak the right language, or you don't belong here because you don't speak the language. So you have that sort of attitude and that sort of thing going on, and it's very, very critical to the self-identification process, particularly with the forced removal. And that forced removal that is embodied in a print like that one is the King of Fools again, is pivotal to what happens to those people who move to different places. How much they become part of the fluxus in terms of change, and how much they become part of an isolated minority on the outskirts or periphery, or the unseen, unheard. So this is another version of the King of Fools who Cocker was amazing. Just another aspect of how one might reflect on the idea of displacement, and the chairs do come up quite a bit as well. I find that the idea of community, or now we're getting to another point, in as much as I've been talking, it's been kind of framed within the self, and the identification of self as one moves forward. But I'm also very much interested in this idea of the interpersonal relationship. And the interpersonal relationship that is embodied in some of my work usually takes the symbolic space of 2 chairs or 3 chairs in a space, and one of them doing something. So the chairs become almost human embodiment for things that that could symbolize presence or absence of humanity in some ways. I think all of you are very much aware, and I know you mentioned Stellenbosch 360, aware of the monkeys that were all over the place in town, the benches, and the part of the drive for that was to provide communal spaces for people to either regard them as artworks or to sit down and take a break. And people were using them in some ways, and that forging of a communal space is also quite important. In this respect, with the chairs that create a communal space for me, there's always a dialectic. There's always, as soon as you have if you have one person in the room, you have someone thinking, ruminating on something. If you have 2 people in a room, you have politics. So the idea of that power play, which is pretty much a Fanonian, or Frantz Fanon established the idea of political dominance over the other, as well as Michel Foucault, which is he remarks on knowledge and power, and he treats it almost as if it's a negotiable space. So power is always negotiable. I talk, you listen, you talk, I listen, and if I don't want to listen to you, I start talking louder. So that negotiation of power is always an interesting space for one. And for me, I found those interactivities between interpersonal relationships to be quite yes.
So the reason why I decided to portray the chairs looking unstable.
Well, that's exactly what it is. You know, the idea, when you walk into a room and you see a chair, you see chairs around the table, for instance, and then there's an extra one sitting in the corner. Like always, there's this little disquieting. It's like, why is that one in the corner? I always find, you know, I always find I've developed this thing where I look for where you can control the power dynamics in the room by putting chairs in a certain way. And you can establish, I think all of you come from homes where, I don't know, your parents might have their chairs, the chairs that they sit in, and you shouldn't sit in. Or, you know, those are things that one grows up with. So they become ultimately symbolic of this power dynamic and this relationship. Not so dissimilar to a power dynamic established by some sort of despot who goes crazy and says, this is my chair, this is where I will sit. There's one image which I didn't put in here, which might have been nice to look at. This image is part of, you can't really see it so well, but it's a meta-tint, a very small image, about this big. It's called Self-Portrait as a Zimbabwean. Underneath it, you don't see it here, but there's an etching plate, which is a small one, not this big, which is a direct copy of my fingerprint. I traced it, and, well, I didn't trace it, I impressed it into brass, and now it's fully existent in a brass plate. So, in all these explorations, what I'm looking for are these symbolic negotiations, these symbolic ways of trying to identify one space to the next. Please stop me if you kind of need to ask a question. Just ask a question. Okay. Here's a piece called The Other State. I don't know if you can see that too clearly. So now you have a figure sitting on a chair, but in between him is this barrier, because behind that barrier is a figure. It's a tumultuous nightmare of ideas or things he might not be sure about. And it is that sort of tension that one brings about in terms of in a space of self-reflection. So, at the end of it, as we move to the next piece, I want to raise this idea of the inclusive society. Pretty good. I'll leave some time for questions. The inclusive society, as you guys might be thinking about it, coming back to this idea of the notions of home. This notion of home that is about trying to find your place and trying to negotiate your place. And once one realizes that home does actually become a place of negotiation, not necessarily a point of origin, then we are going to get into a place of creating or encouraging an inclusive society, I believe. And my big question at the end of it all, and this is part of the groundings of the PhD that I'm doing, is can an individual have an impact through self-realization to a certain point on society? Can the individual create or contribute to an inclusive society more so than rely on a group manifestation of things? So that is a very interesting question for me, partly because in a space like Africa, or contextually in Southern Africa, we have quite a lot of conflicting ideas, such as Ubuntu, and we also have family bonds and historical bonds that may come from all sorts of traditions. And it's these little things that perhaps inform the way we operate within a society, within our groupings. Don't get me wrong here, but I will say something that does terrify me, or something that I think very carefully about. People in groups don't often think too well. Men in groups terrify me. And I'll be honest, men in groups terrify me. There's something that happens, mob psychology. So the one thing that is a reluctance in some ways, is sort of step back, a kind of self-reflexive point that one has to reach to sort of say to yourself, how can one contribute as an individual to something that is perhaps can be changed? So this idea of the individual and the self, conflicting with the idea of Ubuntu, and this is again part of an area of my research, is that if Ubuntu basically means not just Ubuntu, but the idea of the family and the bonds that we all have, could become or are in some ways, I'm speaking deeply in a philosophical, well, in a rather broad philosophical way, but if we have a situation where I am because I'm reflected on by other people, I am because of other people, where is the self, where's the foundation for a self to be recognized and to be enacted upon? Is it such that a, shall I say, want of an existentialism or individualist way of thinking cannot function within an African society? And if so, must we perpetuate a group mentality of thinking, therefore leading to us only making decisions as groups? Some people might think that's quite a dangerous thing, and it has been dangerous in the past, let's say. And it might be quite contentious at the moment, where we have a road statue being acted upon as a group way of thinking and not necessarily a discursive space for individuals to stand up and say, well, hold on a second. Yes,
sorry, could that be turned on its head and say that an individual perspective or an individual's own motives in doing it without a group, without a consensus of other people, could in fact be as detrimental as when you say groups?
Correct. I think that one has to find this balance. It's a negotiation, as I've always said. I think that it's not necessarily that you have to stand outside and be completely individual and lost I think the establishment of the self in a foundation sort of sense of being is first and foremost the most important. It's key. You can't just walk down the street and expect to be the same as everybody else. I think that, now this is me speaking personally, a great number of our mistakes in our histories have been made by people who think they think the same. And I won't attack religion, but it is an interesting example in that respect. So the idea that self perhaps could be have a foundation of its own and interact on the group mentality, that's the key. And where does that self reside? And therefore, could we have power as an individual to encourage social and group inclusiveness? So there is a move at the moment within post-colonial writings to move from the idea of multiculturalism rather into thinking of interculturalism. And I'd like to sort of round it up by the idea of humanism and the idea of being human. And this was taken from Anne Phillips's talk she gave this last week. And I was struck by what she was able to say. Is that in the three ways of understanding humanity, or being human, the one being that we could assuage all fears of ourselves by saying, so I'm just going to start flashing. The one phase of being human is that, okay, let's negate all these differences. Let's try and see and agree for ourselves that we are all okay on the inside, we're all the same on the inside. But that abstract way of thinking, in other words, looking beneath the skin, looking beneath the experience, looking beneath whatever histories we may have, is in some ways also detrimental. You lose a sense of the defining characteristics that make you different, that apply self to you. The other one, the next one being, if you then say, fine, we're different but we accept, then it becomes a process of tolerance. And tolerance is not by no means a sense of acceptance or inclusiveness. It simply just demarcates your borders. The next one being a sense of humanitarianism, which is that if need be, we can help. And here's a good example. Say Red Cross flies in to help a certain country at a certain point in time. The value of life is all very important for Red Cross to be there. But say you pull, say something really bad happens and the alarm bells go off and massive warnings and war breaks out, Red Cross helpers are pulled out and that can be read as certain lives suddenly become a little bit more important than others. Right, so the humanitarian prospect of what it means to deal with that process of inclusiveness. It might be the same as how Kaimandi or Kailita are being handled at the moment. It's all right to sort of drive in there and clean things up, but then you drive out again because you can go home to Clifton. So, there's these little things that one needs to think about. So how does she go about this? How does she go around the idea of this inclusiveness? Right. If one, as self, were to be able to recognize human as, not I am black and human, but rather I'm black as, I'm a human as a black person, as a son, and so forth. And therefore, the definition of humanity becomes the key, the core, as to seeing a way to have inclusiveness in some ways. Let's just run through a few more of these. I want to end with one of these. Okay, so that's part of my conversational pieces, the idea of the Braille word there says listen, and it's printed in screen print, which is flat, which obfuscates the idea of reading or feeling it, so you don't hear it. It's difficult and undeniable. And then there's this piece. So this idea of defining yourself, well, if the core of the idea of that is being, or understanding self, negotiating self between different polarities or discourses of where did I come from, who am I, where have I been, and where am I going to stay, helps one to define one as human. Then maybe negotiation towards a process of inclusiveness becomes a little more easy. This piece here is called Murmuration, and it was actually on show here at the Church Gallery in Gus. Dorp Street. I think maybe some of you played Chuck into there? Okay. And it is, I was intrigued by the idea of this group mentality, the sense of we all flow together as human beings. It's called flocking mentality. And flocking mentality is something very interesting in that, I'll just give you a taste of what it is in terms of experimental scientific terms. Let's say about 100 people are put into a room. 2 people are given a designed walking path. The rest of them are told, walk anywhere you want to walk. Do whatever you want. At whatever pace you want to, just walk. Within 30 minutes, people had gravitated to the people who had a walking path, designated path. Whether they were walking erratically or what, but they kept to that path. Before they knew it, the group had split up into 2 groups, and they were following one of the 2. That's flocking mentality. Human beings do it. This is a piece that I did in relation to that, which is a murmuration. A murmuration of starlings happens up in Northern Europe, and it's when these starlings at sunset burst into the sky, thousands and thousands upon them. I don't know if any of you have seen it, it's a massive thing. And they swirl, they fly everywhere. They move in these patterns that are organic and they look ridiculously synchronized. None of the birds crash into each other. And they do this movement, this synchronized movement, by simply just transmitting micro movements. So if one flaps a wing slightly, the other one realizes and passes that signal on, and eventually you have this convoluted wave of movement. The thing about this is that it's actually a political battle. The ones on the outside are flying as fast as they can to get to the center, so that they can fly even harder, so that when they roost, and it gets cold at night, the warmer birds are brought into the center of the roost, and the colder birds stay to the end, and they fall down dead. So in this piece, I was kind of like remarking on the idea that to get a seemingly seamless movement of individuals or a group might actually be more reliant on the individual more than one thinks. But at the same time, it has this again, very negotiable space as to who it benefits at the end of the group or the individual. And with that, I think I'd like to end with just, maybe words of encouragement and say if you build the future, the city of the future, think to what you want to preserve, think to what you want to look to, but please keep inclusiveness in flux. Thanks.